let's talk about local development techniques with Kubernetes. Well, a lot of us like to do containers as a downstream concern. We'll just like let the DevOps thing happen. Well, what if that doesn't quite work? What if we need to take more control locally? Or what if we want to install a data store in a really interesting way? So let's take a look at a bunch of tools that will help us run with containers. So let's start really easy. I've got this Docker file, and this Docker file talks to a Node application. I've got my Node application. It's here, and it's just spitting out some stuff. And so, okay, now how do I do it? Well, I start off here, and I say Docker build. I need a dot for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. And let me tag it with hello node v0.1. Oh, wait, no, I need to put the dot over here, not over here. And then once I've done that, I do a Docker run. Okay, so hello node v0.1. Do I need a dot? No, I don't think I need a dot in this case, but oh, I need a dash P, but it doesn't go here, it goes over here, dash P 3000, colon 3000. I've done a lot of thinking to try and just launch my application. What if we could instead just say Docker compose up? Now the cool thing about Docker compose is that we have this file that then says all of the things that we need to do. So the dot is right here. The hello node v0.1 is here. The ports are here. Oh, I totally forgot about setting this environment variable. And I just say Docker compose up, and it just does all the things. So let's go hit localhost 3000, and now we get at our application. Cool. Now that one was an easy one, but if you've ever used Docker Compose and you're like, well, I spun up 2 different Docker Compose files, and now they create incompatible networks, then let me show you this, network motive bridge. Now the cool thing about network motive bridge is that it won't spin up a new virtual network. Instead, it will use the network that it already has. So if I launch 2 Docker Compose files, now my application can communicate together. So maybe I have a Docker Compose file for my data stores, I have a Docker Compose file for my back end, and if I'm doing the front end, I'll just launch them both. If I'm doing my back end, I'll only launch my data stores one. So that can be really cool, this network motive bridge. On the upside, it doesn't create a network. On the downside, it doesn't create DNS entries for each of my applications. So I may need to take a little bit more control there. Maybe I need to create my own network and just specify the same network name in both Docker Compose files. Cool, so that one was an easy one. Docker Compose is a great way to not have to remember stuff. Now Docker Desktop is cool. Docker Desktop is one of those tools that allows us to, well, we can just come in here to the settings and click on Run Kubernetes, and now we have both a Docker mode and a Kubernetes mode. Cool. Now what if we want to run differently? Well, we could use Podman or Rancher Desktop. I'm going to show you Minikube. Now the cool thing about Minikube is that Minikube allows us to just spin up a virtual machine that allows us to have both a Docker environment and a Kubernetes environment. And in fact, I have not only this one running right here, but I also have other ones running for other demos. Now they're stopped right now, but if I was going to do a demo of those, then I could pull up those. So we can do this. We can come in here. Let's Docker compose down. It's stopping. No, really, it's stopping. OK, let's do that. Down. There we go. So I would do a Minikube start, and now I can start up that thing. In my case, I can say --VM driver is Hyper-V in this case, or I could do VMware or VirtualBox, and I could run with whatever virtualization platform I have. So once I'm started, then I can say Minikube IP, and this is the IP address of that virtual machine that it spun up. Now the cool thing, Docker Desktop is definitely the easy button. Minikube is the batteries included internals exposed version. So for example, when I'm teaching Docker, a lot of people are like, well, where's that volume stuff stored? And I say Docker volume list, and we see that volume, and they're like, but where is, where is that? And I do this mythical hand-waving thing, and I talk about WSL, and I say, okay, so here's this Docker desktop data, and maybe it's in there somewhere, and they're like, but I want to touch it, I want to feel it. Let's SSH into Minikube. Now that we're SSH'd, I'm going to sudo su cd var lib docker. Where are your volumes? They are right there. With Minikube, the internals, the batteries included internals exposed version, you can get at the content. You can root into your virtual machine and you can start to poke at it. Now, it is the internals, batteries included in internals exposed version. So we have the ability to do both Docker things and Kubernetes things, but we do need to take one additional piece. Minikube Minikube Docker env, and that will output the environment variables that I need to set to be able to get my Docker CLI and my Docker tools to be able to understand that. Now, it understands what shell I'm using. In this case, I'm using PowerShell, so it outputted those PowerShell things. So once I set those things, now I can do Docker image list, and I am connected to Minikube as if it was Docker desktop. Cool. Now, it doesn't actually map the ports. I don't get the local host experience. So if I do want to mount a volume, I actually need to mount my directory into the Linux virtual machine as a directory, and then I can, from there, do mapping into my volumes. So it is the batteries included internals exposed version, but I can do this. Minikube config, add-ons list, and here's a bunch of add-ons that I just need to turn on. So if I wanted to play with the metric server, I can say just go turn on the metric server. Or if I want to play with Istio, just go turn on Istio. If I want to turn on Ingress, I just turn on Ingress. And I don't have to futz with all of the things. These are just add-ons that are included. By comparison, if I want to do this on Docker Desktop, I'm wandering through forums, I'm looking through docs, I'm grabbing YAML files, and yeah, batteries included, internals exposed. So one of the things that I didn't show you while we were here, but was actually really cool, was while we were browsing to this site, I actually wasn't on localhost. I was on Minikube 3000. So yeah, I don't get that localhost automatic mapping, but I do get some really serious power, which is cool. So we'll use Minikube for the rest of the demos. That'll be cool. Next up, let's take a look at Docker Watch. Now, I would love to CD3. I have a Docker file here. I have a server. I would love to say docker run -- watch and have it just pick up any changes that I do, automatically rebuild, deploy. That's not a thing. But I can say Skaffold dev, and let's take a look at Skaffold. Skaffold is a really, Docker Watch is coming to Docker Compose, by the way. It's a beta feature, and I'm really excited. But let's wander through to Skaffold. Now, the cool thing about Skaffold is open source, and it allows us to be able to do that kind of watch and rebuild thing. It can optionally push your image up to a container registry, and it can restart that in Kubernetes. So we did our Skaffold dev here, and it did the build, and it launched. Let's see where it's running. kubectl get all. It looks like we're running on port 32,000. So I'll come back over here and let's launch Minikube 32,000, and now I get my application. Cool. Now, let's say instead of saying hello world, I'm going to say hello GIDS. Cool. I just push save. Oh, I guess I have to be on the right screen here. And it's going to automatically notice that I save stuff. It's going to automatically rebuild my image, maybe push that image up to a registry, and it's going to restart that in Kubernetes. Now, if I hurry, I can see the old one coming down. Yeah, if I'm screen sharing and I'm running Minikube and I'm projecting and I've got a bunch of other stuff running, it takes a minute for me, but it's usually really instantaneous. Let me go a little industrial strength. kubectl, delete that pod. Oh, it's already gone. Cool. And so now, without doing anything, let's go back to that web page, and we can push refresh. And now it doesn't say hello world, it says hello GIDS. That's cool. We've got kind of this Docker watch experience where we can just code, we can push save, and it will automatically redeploy. A little bit of magic inside of NodeMon or another suite, browser auto refresh, and we can get it to automatically refresh the page too. Cool, Docker watch. Can't wait for that to be built in, but in the meantime. So here's that Kubernetes YAML file that it deployed. It deployed a service and a deployment. And the Skaffold file is just really simple, where I say, here's the files that I want to watch. Here's the image name that I want to build. Here's the Kubernetes manifest that I want to deploy. And it just does all the things. Cool. So let's pop out of Skaffold. Ooh, I could take the Skaffold survey in the middle of presenting. I think I'll pass. Okay, so we did quick rebuild. Next, let's take a look at visualizing the contents of our container. Now, we're going to look at it in Docker mode. We're going to look at it in Kubernetes mode. We'll look at it from the command line, and we'll look at it from UI. So first, let's start with the command line in Docker. I'm going to say dive. Oh, let's do it the hard way. Docker history, hello node, v0.1. Okay, so we can see all the layers. We can see which ones were done by whom and what command that they ran. We can see the approximate size of that layer, but we don't really get to touch and feel the things. So let's run dive. Dive, hello node. It's going to go pull it from a registry, except for it's local, so it doesn't need to. Internet is a wonderful thing. And so let's take a look at dive. Also open source. And it allows us to be able to browse through the files in our image to be able to see, maybe we can do some optimizations here. So let's take a look at this. Here we've got the layers in our image, and we can cruise up and down through them. Let's come over here and close some folders so that we can see this. sbin, user, var. Okay. Now this is the original layer from scratch. Go do this. Then next layer, let's add some stuff. Oh, cool. We've got node and npm coming into place. Let's add yarn. That's what happens in this layer. That's pretty cool. Then here's where my Docker file begins. I created that workdir/app. So there's the app folder right here up at the top. We can see the app folder up here. Next layer down, here's all of the copy statements. So we can see that I just said copy ... to be able to copy all the files. And wait a minute, I've got my application, but I also copied my Docker compose file and my Docker file. That's probably not great. Let's create a Docker ignore file that will ignore those. So let's come in here, new file, .docker ignore, and I'll ignore Docker file, Docker compose.yaml. I probably also want to exclude node modules, package, lock.json. and JSON, and we can look at a lot of other files. Now if Skaffold was still running, it would go, oh hey, I've got some things, and would automatically rebuild and deploy it. But in this case, we've killed off Skaffold, and so we can now get a feel for how this image works. Now it's cool. If all we have is SSH onto the server, we can SSH in, we can run dive, we can navigate through these pieces of this Docker image. Another way that we might do this, let's come in here to 4 and turn on Python and start up Whaler. Now what is Whaler? Well, Whaler is a UI tool that, yes, I do want to start Python. Whaler is a great way to be able to visualize the contents of our image in a web page. So here's the Whaler documentation. Let's take a look at the one that we just started. And it's running on localhost 8000, so let's pop it open. We have 3 files: server, Docker Compose, Dockerfile, and we can see the relative sizes here. Now in this case, I only have 3 files, so it maybe is a rather boring example of this, but let's go back to their example here. Oh, did I not open it? I did not. Let's open it. So we can take a look at theirs and we can see, oh, here's a really big file. If I can find a way to trim this one or use a smaller version, I can gain a lot of stuff. Here's another big one that I might want to look at. Now here's a lot of little things. You know your node modules folder or your packages folder or your pip cache that's like, this big? It's great to be able to visualize this because I'm like, well, if I made this file smaller, but if I made this file smaller, my image is going to get significantly smaller. So I love being able to visualize this, just be able to cruise through and take a look at the content in our application. Cool. Whaler. Let's turn off Python. There we go. Cool. Now let's take a look at visualizing our cluster. We'll start with the Docker mode and take a look at how we might do this in Docker. Where'd my cursor go? There it is. No, my cursor is gone. There it is. Okay. Lazy Docker. Now, Lazy Docker is a really cool way of visualizing how the system works inside of Docker mode. Now, this is just from a command line, so if you can only SSH into your Raspberry Pi or into your server, you can start to do some really interesting things to be able to look at the details on your server. Yeah, clicking in a command line. That's cool. So let's take a look at our Docker server. Well, we've got a few pods running. I can cruise through those. I've got Kata running. Here's some closed ones. Let's take a look at etcd. That's a good one. And now let's take a look at the stats. I love this. Oh, etcd hasn't been doing very much. That's cool. Let me find one that's a little bit more stuff going on. There we go. A live view of my stuff. Now this doesn't work in the Windows command prompt because I can't actually click into the command prompt, but here in PowerShell, in Bash, I can just click through and take a look at all of the details associated with my cluster. That's cool. Here's the containers. I could also take a look at the images that I've got in my system. So hello node, there's the details there. And it looks like I've got some, I haven't tagged all the layers there, but that's kind of fun. I can take a look through my volumes. And this is really cool. That's the path to the volume on disk. Cool. So that's visualizing it from the command line. Let's visualize it with the UI. And for this, I'm going to Docker compose up. And this is Portainer. Now, the cool thing about Portainer is it's a great way to be able to visualize a Docker cluster, to be able to look at the things. You can do it both locally and remotely, and apparently I haven't told them I don't want cookies yet. And so I went to their docs page, and I grabbed the Docker compose file for Portainer. And we do need to map in the Docker socket, which is good. I've already done that here. And I also wanted to save my data, which is pretty cool too. Now let's head off to localhost 9000. And we'll take a look at Portainer. The hardest part of this demo, setting my password. Oh, it needs to be longer. Is that long enough? Yes, woohoo. Okay, now we can connect to a remote environment if we wanted to. I'm going to connect with my local environment though. So here's my local environment. There's interesting news. And now I can take a look at it. Well, I've got one thing running. There's my dashboard. But I could also take a look at the containers that I have running, and it's going to show me all of the Kubernetes details. I could also take a look at all of the images that I've got on this system, and I can start to now visually navigate through the thing. So let's create a new container. I'm going to come in here and say add a container, and I want to run hello node v0.1. And I also want to publish a port, so 3000 to 3000, and I want to deploy the container. Cool. So now hello node is running in my cluster. It wasn't before. And now I can see it here in this list. Way down here at the bottom. There we go. Here's the container that I just started. Now, this is cool because I can start to wander through this container. Here's the Docker logs, so it says that it's running. That's nice. Here's the config. If you've ever had to go look for an IP address, then this can be really helpful because I can just open the nodes and get to where I need to. So, by the way, nope, not there. Ports. I can start to wander through the configuration and take a look at it. By comparison, if you're doing this on the command line, it's a whole lot of pipe it to grep4, scroll back up, and so being able to navigate through this is really cool. Not only that, I can take a look at the console for this. Now it is an Alpine container, so I'll switch from bash to ash, and now I will launch it, and now I am inside the container from my browser. So I could say node server, and of course that port is in use because it's running in the actual container. But a great way to be able to debug a container is saying, hey, it's not starting up correctly. Let me go connect to it. Oh, hey, I didn't set the work dir. It's off in some other directory. That's why it's not started. The files aren't here. So let's come back here, and I'll say exit. And now I'm back in my browser. Once we're done with this, we can remove this. And now that's not running in my cluster. That's cool. Portainer is a really good way to be able to visualize the Docker side of this. So let's take down Portainer, Docker compose down. And now let's take a look at how we might visualize the Kubernetes side of things. Now, the interesting thing about the Kubernetes side is we have deployments and services. And yeah, Portainer can start to visualize this. But let's look at K9s. K9s. K9s is an open source project that is able to visualize Kubernetes in a really elegant way and has kind of VI-like binding. So I learned to code in VI, and it is amazing. So I can take a look at this. Let's look at the particular cluster, and here's my pods. I want to look at a different namespace. So namespace, nope. Colon, namespace. Let me get to the Kata namespace. Here's my services running inside of Kata, and I can take a look at those, and I can start to dig in for the logs of that particular service. If you can only SSH into your cluster, maybe your Raspberry Pi or maybe a remote server, then this is a great way to be able to quickly navigate through that cluster without having to install a whole bunch of stuff and wander through. So K9s. Now that was great from the command line. Let's take a look at how we might do that from a UI. Oh, is my monitor? That is weird. K9s, there we go. Schooner. Now Schooner, formerly K-, is a great way to be able to visualize Kubernetes. So here's our Schooner dashboard, and we can then, or this is the Schooner GitHub page, we can start to take a look at how we might look at this in Kubernetes mode. So now that we've got that created, kubectl get all. What is the port? It is 32,000, excellent. So let's head off to localhost 32,000. And now we're at our Schooner authentication page. Now Kubernetes does come with a dashboard, but it doesn't have authentication turned on by default, which can be wonderful. It also doesn't expose its IP publicly, but it's just cake to flip it from a cluster IP to a node port or even to a load balancer, and now it is exposed publicly. Oops. Tesla had their cluster exposed publicly, and they became a crypto mine. So yeah, the built-in dashboard is not great. So let's go grab our authentication token, and we will paste it in here. And now we can log into Schooner. Now we can take a look at the various things. I only have one node in my cluster, so that's interesting. Here's my one node, my Minikube node. We can take a look at the details of that node. It's Linux, here's its IP address, its Docker container runtime. I can take a look at the various namespaces in my system. I've got default Kata, kube system, kube public. I like to wander through here looking at storage and looking at volumes, because it's really easy for us to accidentally forget a volume. So in this case, I don't have any volumes, that's great. The other thing we can take a look at is secrets. So let's take a look at the secrets. And right now I'm just looking at the default namespace, but I could switch to all namespaces and see all of the secrets that I've got in my cluster. But switching back to the default namespace, we can see the Schooner token. And this is how I authenticated to Schooner. Now, I don't mind showing you this because it's only running on my local machine. If you can hack into my machine, that's a whole nother issue. But that's the authentication token that I used. If I have access to the cluster enough to get the secret, I have access enough to be able to run Schooner. Cool. So we can take a look at a really cool way of visualizing our Kubernetes cluster with Schooner. So whether we're looking at the Docker mode with the command line, with lazy Docker, or Portainer to look at it, the Docker mode more with a UI, or if we're looking at Kubernetes mode with K9s from the command line, or with Schooner from the UI, we get a great way to be able to visualize our cluster in interesting ways. So let's stop Schooner, kubectl delete -f, Schooner. There we go, Schooner is down. Next, let's take a look at debugging our containers. Now, one of the things that's wonderful and frustrating to do is to kind of get a feel for how we might dig into the contents of that container. So I've got this project here, and I want to take it for a spin. I've got a .devcontainer.json, dev container folder here with a dev container JSON in it. Let's start that up. Let's start VS Code here. And one of the cool things about VS Code is it's going to say, hey, I noticed that you have a .dev container folder and a dev container JSON in it. Would you like to run this in a container? Why, yes, I would. So the cool part is it's actually going to relaunch VS Code and split it in half. I like to watch the logs. It does take a little bit to spin up, but watching the logs go is just cool. So what's happening here? Well, we're taking VS Code and we're splitting it into two pieces. We have the UI piece running on my local machine, and we have another piece that's running inside that container. We have that exposed port so I can connect to it. We also have a volume mount so that I can be able to edit the source code there. And so now I'm able to edit my code in a container with a different runtime. So I was working on a project where I was building a sample in Java and in .NET and in Node and in Ruby and in Python, and I really didn't want to install another environment. So I came in here and I said, let me just hook this up. And I was able to get a UI in place in each of those. So right here, I've got the remote containers extension installed. The remote containers extension is what powers this. And the remote development extension actually includes both the remote containers extension, which I see is now named dev containers, but it also includes one for WSL and one for SSH. And so I can now remote into my Raspberry Pi and edit it inside of VS Code. Instead of the whole, edit it here and FTP it over again, let me just log in there and futz with it there. So I've got this folder. Once I've got that extension installed, I've got this folder, and I want to add new files. So I can come in here and I can say, add dev container configuration files, and it will then give me a bunch of examples that I can play with. Do I want to do it in Node or in Python? Do I want to start with Ruby or with something else? And I can start to quickly scaffold out these dev container JSON files. Or I can come in here and say, try a sample, do dev container, and then that will spin up a sample where I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to add it to my repository or do anything. I just start it up and away it goes. You can see the list is similar. But then once I'm ready to do this in my project, add dev container configuration files, and it will help me scaffold out that dev container.json. So let's take a look at that dev container.json file. Here's my thing. And actually, let me do this because this is really fun. New terminal, uname -a. Yep, this is real live Linux. I am not running on Windows anymore. I'm running inside the container in Linux. So we could even come here and say Docker container list. There is the container that it just spun up, that it wanted to, that I'm debugging in. And the cool part is I can come into my application and let's set a breakpoint right here. And then let's come into run and debug. And so we'll debug this application, much like I would in regular VS Code, but now I'm doing it inside of a container. Hey, I noticed that you have a port open. Would you like to open in a browser? Why, yes, I would. And up pops my application. Kind of. Is it frozen? VS Code is blinking. It hit my breakpoint. Running inside the container. So now I can take a look around. Let's say, well, let's take a look at the URL. Oh, it's a GET request. That's cool. The URL is /, and I can do F10 and F11 to be able to wander through just like I'm debugging my application any other way. I'm going to push play, and now we're going to hit the breakpoint again because this time the URL is favicon.ico. Now, of course, I'm going to reply hello world to the fav icon, and it's going to go, wait a minute, that's not an icon. But that was cool. I got to set a breakpoint here in my application. Now that I've run that breakpoint, we can come back and we can see that that application worked just fine. Cool. Debugging inside of my container. Well, how did that work? Let's hit stop and take a closer look at devcontainer.json. So devcontainer.json is that configuration file that tells us how we connect to this remote container, how we might choose to build it. And so in this case, I said this is based on a Docker file. Now this Docker file is not the Docker file that I'll use to deploy to production, but it is that Docker file that I use for debugging it here inside of VS Code. Notice that we don't have any copy, we don't have any CMD or entry point. We're just installing the things that we need to be able to get it to the point where we can kick it off inside of VS Code. So that Docker file, I could also choose to use just a base image. Then after it starts that Docker file, I want to do this post create command. I want to npm install. So any of the dependencies that my application has, maybe I'm doing a pip install or a Maven rebuild, and just let's get everything in place. I also have some customizations. I have the editor config extension that will get automatically installed inside the container running inside my thing. So I might choose to install language extensions. I could install the Python things, so now I get IntelliSense. I can install all those extensions. And the cool part is if I come in here and say I would like to install an extension, I chose, nope, it's going to do it. I can choose to install it inside the container, and it will add it to my dev container JSON. Cool. I also chose a hover delay so that the text doesn't pop up quite as quickly. I can specify the forwarded ports. It's going to identify the forwarded ports automatically as well. And so what's really cool is this isn't Minikube 3000, but rather localhost 3000. It's proxying them. So if I'm attached to a remote cluster, maybe it's running inside of my cloud, or maybe it's running inside of my deployment environment, and I want to debug that container, I can definitely do that, and it'll still show up as localhost. It automatically proxies it. Now, there are a few things that I needed to do a little bit differently, because here I'm not running inside of Docker Desktop, but I'm running inside of Minikube. So this part is on my machine, and that part is in the container inside of Minikube. Well, how do I hook into Minikube? Well, I need to go specify the Docker environment. Remember those Docker environment variables that Minikube spit out? Those three things that said, here's the IP address, here's where the certificates are. And so I need to specify those details. So I'm going to come here into my settings. And there's my Docker environment settings that says, oh, and by the way, here's how you connect to Docker so you can launch this. Now, I happen to include this in my project so that you would have a great example up on GitHub in the source code for this project. But I also specified them here in my general user settings. So there's my Docker environment, so it knows how to start that remote container, how to connect to it. Now, because Minikube is the batteries included, internals exposed thing, now I'm also, once I've set those environment variables, I also need to map my configuration, my mount point. This mounts my Windows directory into Minikube's Linux environment so that then my container can just pick up /mount/node app, and away it goes. So back in our devcontainer.json, it's going to go look for mount node app, and it's going to mount it into that workspace directory. The one that I specified in my Docker file is the spot that I want it to begin. So this dev container JSON is a great way to be able to debug running services running inside of my container. So we got to take a tour through a bunch of different tools. We talked about how we might start easier using Docker Compose files, and we looked at network mode bridge. We looked at running differently with Minikube. We looked at Skaffold, how we can do Docker Watch, even though Docker Watch doesn't exist. Dive, and each of these are linked in an interesting way. And so all of these tools are great tools to be able to start to embrace the ability to run with containers. It's not just a downstream concern that happens later. You can actually use containers in your development environment in a really elegant way. Now, one question I often get here is, so do I have to now learn all of them? No. You're going to find the tools that work really well for you. And if any of these tools help you to be more powerful in your environment, then that's great. And if none of these tools are helpful, then that's wonderful as well. But start to take a look into containers and peel back the onion and look deeper at those things that you're looking for. This has been a lot of fun to be able to share with you local development techniques with Kubernetes. This gist is available online right now. Thanks for coming.